Hi all, I'm Mike Trebesco from AL Studios, and today we'll talk about how to make programmed drums sound more natural and quite less obviously programmed. So basically, if you start with something like this, you will hopefully be able to achieve something like this. Now, programmed drums certainly have its place in the hierarchy of modern production process. Sometimes bands just do not have the budget to hit the studio and record their drummer properly, so they're after programmed drums in order to achieve some clean drum sound for their productions. And sometimes you just don't have a drummer, or maybe you're a solo musician and you need some drums to have a place in your production. Either way, it's fine, and you certainly can have very decent results with programmed drums, but there are, of course, limitations with the technology, and of course, if you don't utilize the process correctly, you may end up with something sounding very two-dimensional, not transparent, flat, and fake. So there are two areas to focus your attention while working on programmed drums. And these are, first, the way you program the drum parts, and second, the way you produce the actual drum sound. So my goal is to shed some light on these two areas, and hopefully you will be able to better understand how to treat them correctly. So first, and quite an obvious thing to keep in mind, is diversity of the drum parts that you're constructing. Sometimes, if you're a guitar player and you're not that familiar with the way drummers perform their parts in precise detail, you may end up putting the same drum fill, similar rolls all across a song, as well as similar cymbal strokes and chokes here and there. And that's something that is really obvious, and it's very easy to tell when listening to a song. So if you just keep it in mind, and if you avoid putting similar parts in same positions on the song, for example, chorus into the bridge, you will end up with more diversity and much less obviously programmed drum sound. But if you're not sure how to actually do it, just go on YouTube and have a listen to drum parts in solo of your favorite drummers. Or maybe have a listen to MIDI loops that you can take from any famous drummers as well, and that will give you some perspective on how to diversify those parts. And just having this in mind will really allow you to make your parts stand out better. So we're going to have a look at the diversity of the parts here in this example. And I'm using Superior Drummer 3 as my system to create drums, but this tutorial is basically relevant to any other systems, regardless of the manufacturer. So these principles will be applicable to basically anything. So we have these initial drums. And although the idea of the song is very industrial, this sound a bit repetitive. So my goal was to diversify those parts a bit and have a look at what I've come up with. I mean, there is a fair bit of deviation from the original idea, which has been approved by the artist, and you don't necessarily need to go that deep, but as a general idea, just to give a few extra feels here and there and human feeling, that's a good way to do so. And the way you pick those feels is basically, if we consider Superior Drummer 3 as an example, just like this. So you basically pick whichever you prefer and whichever feel suits to the original message of the song and to the music better. And that's literally about it. Then the second aspect, which is very important and is very often neglected, is velocity randomization. And let's talk about it in more detail here. When you compose drum parts, you have a temptation of putting each velocity of each hit to its absolute maximum so that it just slams and blasts. But in real life, this never works because your drummer cannot play each note, first of all, with same intensity, and secondly, with maximum intensity across all of them. So that's exactly where natural feel is lost. Especially if you're working with Guitar Pro and you're importing MIDI files created in Guitar Pro in a different program, that's automatically happening. And I'm going to demonstrate an example where you can hear an A-B comparison with velocity sitting on its maximum level and then velocity randomized by just a simple algorithm in your Digital Audio Workstation. So velocity randomization is a big part of making program drums sound more natural. If you have a look at this example here, these drums were exported from a different software and hence all the velocities are at maximum. And that's how they sound with the velocity at maximum. There is not much of a variation here. Now let's try to make these velocities a bit more random by following a humanization procedure here in Logic Pro X. But again, in any other digital audio workstation, you can find a way to make it more random easily. So immediately we have more variation, kick sound a bit more different, a bit more dynamic, and that automatically makes it sound more natural. Have a listen before. And after. So that is a big help and quite an easy way to make those program drums stand out a bit better. Another way to make those velocities be a bit more different is taking certain parts, for example hi-hats or cymbals, played through a MIDI library on a MIDI kit. And if you just have straight 4th or 8th note hat pattern, you can just copy it from another MIDI kit instead of programming it, and it will again sound more natural. Before. And after. Last but not the least, we'll talk about the actual sound of program drums that you're getting for. And again, the common problem that I see often enough is that people are after really heavily processed sound, compressed, heavily EQ'd, at the very beginning of the production process for program drums. And that's, again, where the difference lies between program drums and real drums, because in the studio, real drums are treated very mildly at the source stage, and there is enough headroom left up to the mixing stage where the actual processing happens. And by leaving that headroom, you will allow yourself to make better and more informative decisions in the context of the mix. More often than not, those program drums, heavily compressed, heavily EQ'd, will just sound out of place because they don't match to the context of the mix. And again, I'm going to show you an A-B comparison of those heavily processed drums in the mix and then raw drums. So when producing the actual sound for the program drums, you have a temptation to throw everything in on the initial stage. So compression, use some presets, which are heavily processed, heavy EQ. You may end up with something sounding like this at the very beginning of your project. Doesn't sound bad, but it's very much compressed if you listen to the kick and the snare. Not much of a dynamic range, and you won't be able to pull it back. So if you strip all this dynamic and heavy EQ processing plugins back and just go with the raw sound, with the initial sound of the program drum recording, you may have something like this. kind of sounds worse, but if you listen closely enough, you will notice that there is a lot of dynamic range in this recording, as well as a lot of room in it and headroom. And it kind of sounds closer to the recording which you get from the studio with the real drums, rather than the first example that I showed you. And then if you make decisions in terms of compression, equalization, and such in the context of your mix, rather than just in isolation, and if you process these raw drums similarly to the way you normally mix real drums, you may as well end up with something like this. And it's pretty compressed as well, but it is processed in the context of the mix and works with the rest of instrumentation so that everything glues together properly. So I guess basically the main idea here is treat your program drums similarly to your real drums, and your results will be closer to natural sound than you would have anticipated. So guys and girls, please, any questions, any considerations, any details that are not clear, just hit me up in the comment section or just send me a message and I'm happy to help. Best of luck.